Hi everyone, welcome to my talk. My name is Wang Cen. Today I will talk about NIM, Generative Neural Networks for Simulation Input Modeling. This project is a collaboration between Emily Herbert, Professor Peter Haas, and me at UMass Amherst. Simulations are widely used to improve existing systems. For example, they can be used to improve the efficiency of emergency rooms and call centers. Input models are fitted to represent input processes in a system, and then during simulation run, new samples from these models are drawn to drive the simulation. Currently, people use simple models like probability distribution or complex models like stochastic processes such as ARMA or non-homogeneous sound process. Input modeling is really the key to simulation because accurate input models ensure we have credible results. However, this is very challenging. Although distribution fitting software exists, these software usually only fits many distribution families on historical data and recommends the best based on goodness of fit metrics. This approach fails for complex IID distribution and stochastic process. For example, we did an experiment on expert fit, as you can see in the table on the right. Only in the case of IID beta and IID exponential did it give us a good model. In other cases, it tells us it cannot find a good model. The worst case are for ARMA and non-homogeneous sound process. Expert fit misleadingly tells us a Johnson and a Pearson distribution is a good fit for the data. Although expert fit does provide autocorrelation plot for diagnostics, but if the autocorrelation plot suggests non-IID distribution, it is unclear what we should do next. The good news is that the data is now becoming increasingly abundant, thanks to IoT sensors, logs, and annotated machine vision systems. With so much data, we can do better. NIM, or Neural Input Modeling, is a neural network-based solution to input modeling we've been developing recently. It can automatically fit to complex stochastic processes, which means you do not need to specify a model for your data, like non-homogeneous sound process. It can automatically and efficiently generate sample passes. It avoids overfitting and can exploit prior knowledge like ID, bounds, and multimodal structure. It has a novel architecture. It uses variational autoencoder and long short-term memory network, both of which are modern machine learning techniques. Variational autoencoder enables us to generate new samples from the model after training, and long short-term memory network enables us to concisely capture the temporal correlation of the data. NIM takes inspiration from the widely used inversion method. It is known that if Z is a standard normal, then X equals GZ equals F inverse of phi of Z is distributed with CDF-F, where phi is the CDF of standard normal. We can extend this idea to a stochastic process, X1 through Xt. We can first write the CDF of this stochastic process as this form, using the chain rule of probability. Then, if we have Z1 through Zt that are all standard normals, and we set X1 equals G1 Z1, X2 equals G2 Z2 given X1, and so on, then we have specified a function G to transform a bunch of standard normals into stochastic process X. And since this G function can be very complex, and neural networks are powerful function learners, we can use them to learn this complex function. In the remaining part of the talk, I will first briefly introduce you neural networks and generative neural networks. Then I will talk about NIM-VM, which is a simplified model that can only handle IID data. I will introduce the theory of variational autoencoder and a specific neural architecture we use called multi-layer perceptron. Then I will talk about the full model, NIM-VL, which uses long short-term memory network. Neural network is a means of doing machine learning in which a computer learns some complex function by analyzing the training examples. And generative neural networks learns the probability distribution of data, and it can generate novel samples. For example, you can see the faces here is actually generated by a generative neural network. We use a specific type of generative neural network called variational autoencoder, or VAE. It accomplishes the generation tasks via a pair of neural nets, an encoder E and a decoder D. We use the decoder to draw new samples, and the encoder is only used during training. Under the variational autoencoder framework, a real-world data point X is assumed to be generated by the following procedure. First, we sample a latent variable Z from some prior distribution. Then we feed the Z into a function G that outputs a data generation distribution. X is then sampled from this data generation distribution. For convenience, we will use standard normal as our prior and normal distribution with mu hat and sigma hat as our data generation distribution. Notice that both mu hat and sigma hat is a function of Z. So although they are individually normal, but they can be collectively look like the target distribution. And since the G function may be very complex, we will use the neural network or the decoder to learn this function. On the other hand, the encoder E learns the posterior probability Pz given X. Since Pz given X is very complex and expensive to compute via Bayes rule, the encoder will approximate it by a simpler distribution Qz given X, which is also a normal that is parameterized by mu tilde and sigma tilde. Notice that both mu tilde and sigma tilde is a function of X. Again, we will use neural nets to represent the encoder function. Both the encoder and the decoder use a specific neural network architecture called multi-layer perceptron. It is inspired by biology. It has input, hidden, and output layer. At the hidden layer, some nonlinear transformation is applied to the input. And then, at the output, another set of transformation is applied to the hidden layer. Specifically, we can see in the encoder, we first do some matrix multiplication on the input data. Then a max operation is done on the result and the zero vector to compute the hidden layer. The max operation here serves as a nonlinear transformation. We continue to compute mu tilde and sigma tilde. The operations are similar for the decoder. However, the input to the decoder is Z, not X. And the Z is different depending on whether we are in training or generation. During training, the Z is a sample from the normal distribution with mu tilde and sigma tilde. And during generation, the Z is a sample from the standard normal. The W's and the B's are called weights and biases. We denote them as theta in the remaining of the talk. They are learned during the training using data. Both the encoder and the decoder can be trained by choosing theta to minimize the following loss function via stochastic gradient descent. The details of SGD is in our paper. The loss function is comprised of two terms. The first term is the KL divergence between our approximate posterior QZ given X and the prior PZ. The idea here is that the Z values produced by the encoder should look like RID samples from the standard normal. It also acts as a regularizer to avoid overfitting to the data. The second term is the reconstruction loss. The idea here is that given RID standard normal Z values, the Y values we sample from the data generation probability distribution should look like the training data. NIM can be used to model RID data. However, several problems prevent it from being used to model stochastic process. First, the number of neurons grow linearly with the length of the stochastic process. This means if our stochastic process is long, then our weights will be very large. Second, NIM can only handle a fixed input and output size, which means if what we see in the training data is of length 100, we can only generate length 100 data during a simulation run. This is not desirable. Third, multi-layer perceptrons are not good at capturing long-range dependencies, which is a key to modeling complex stochastic process. Next, I will talk about our full model, NIM-VL. At a high level, the architecture is very similar. The changes are highlighted in red. Specifically, we replaced the multi-layer perceptrons inside the encoder and the decoder with long short-term memory networks. These networks are known to be good at capturing long-range dependencies. We also have the concatenation operation here to mimic the generation procedure. During generation, we will sample standard normal and concatenate it with the value that is generated in the previous time step to compute the value of this time step. So we mimic this structure also in the training procedure. Long short-term memory networks are very good at modeling time series because they explicitly model the temporal correlation across time steps. At time step I, the current hidden state and cell state is computed as a function of the previous hidden state and cell state, and also the current input. The HI and the CI here are called hidden state and cell state respectively. They can remember what happened in the past. And after that, we will use the HI to compute mu and sigma just as before. The loss function is also changed accordingly. Since X is a sample pass now, we will do a sum of the KL divergence and the reconstruction loss over the T time steps. The generation procedure of NIM-BL is very simple. We will first sample Zi from the standard normal. We will then compute mu I hat and sigma hat using Zi and Yi minus 1. We then sample the value for the current time step from the normal distribution parameterized by mu hat and sigma hat. We can repeat this procedure until the simulation has ended. In this section, we will talk about the experimental results of NIM. NIM has good modeling accuracy for multi-model distribution. For example, you can see in this figure, the ground truth distribution is a gamma and uniform mixture. Even though you probably wouldn't encounter this bimodal distribution in real life, we choose it as an example because it is very challenging to model accurately. We feed the data to XPerfect and NIM. We can see XPerfect completely missed the multimodal structure of this distribution, but the data generated by our model has an almost identical histogram as the ground truth distribution. We also try to use NIM to model stochastic process. For example, here we use it to model the inter-arrival times from a non-homogeneous sound process with sine wave rate function. We then estimate the empirical rate function of the generated data and plot it against the ground truth rate function. As you can see, they are very close to each other. More interestingly, the training data is only given from time 0 to time 50, which is to the left of this green line. However, our model is able to extrapolate beyond time 50. For AMA, NHPP, and IID gamma uniform distribution, we can compute the log likelihood of the sample pass. So we compute the mean log likelihood of the sample pass NIM generates, and we compare it with the ground truth and XPerfect. The mean likelihood of the sample passes generated by NIM is very close to the ground truth sample passes. It is sometimes much higher than the sample passes generated by XPerfect. Our model is also applicable to real-world datasets. For example, we use it to model the inter-arrival times of San Francisco Fire Department call center. We collect the 1 year of data and use 2/3 for training, and the remaining 1/3 is used for testing. Here, we plot the empirical rate for the sample passes generated by NIM and the remaining 1/3. You can see the empirical rate matches each other very closely. Our final experiment is an end-to-end queue simulation. This is a GIG1 queue whose arrival process is a NHPP with the sine wave rate function, and the processing time distribution is a gamma. We simulate the waiting time for the 60s job. We use NIM to model both the arrival and the processing time process. We compare the distribution of the waiting time against the simulation that uses the ground truth processes in this QQ plot. As you can see, the percentile of the waiting time matches very closely. NIM also has a very fast generation speed. On a commodity 2018 MacBook Pro, we can generate 1 million IID learned exponential random variables in about 0.12 seconds. And we can generate 1,000 sequences of 1,000 learned NHPP inter-arrival times in about 0.85 seconds. This number can be further improved by using GPU. In conclusion, we believe NIM is a promising new tool for simulation input modeling when the data is abundant. It is automated, it has minimal assumptions, and it can capture complex statistical structure. For future work, we plan to investigate conditional NIM for what-if analysis and transferring models. As is shown in other papers, generative neural networks can generate images with some conditions. For example, here we see they generate horses with the condition that they wear a hat. Maybe we can ask the similar question, can we generate inter-arrival sequence for an emergency room when the weather is raining or snowy. This will enable a hospital to make better decisions depending on some external conditions. We also plan to investigate non-stationary processes, discrete random inputs, marked point processes, and multidimensional processes. Thank you very much for attending my talk. Our source code is available at the following link.